Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome back. In today's class, we're going to be looking at a new area in international relations. In the previous 7 lectures, we have looked at the scope of international relations, we've looked at its history. We have also looked at 5 theories, 5 ways of looking at IR, and those are realism, liberalism, feminism, Marxism, and critical theory. Now, having looked at these theories, we are moving on to another area of international relations, which is looking at its constituent actors. So, in the subsequent lectures, I am going to be looking at 3 actors, the 2 kinds of actors in international relations. We're going to start off by looking at international organizations in today's class. In the next class, we'll be looking at the nation state, and in the third class, we'll be looking at globalization. Now, so these 3 areas, international organizations, the nation state, and globalization, present to us a different perspective of politics as transformation, new actors on the international field, and the manner in which these actors are playing off each other, cooperating with each other. And the last lecture, of course, will look at the issue of globalization. So we're going to start off by looking at a curious creature, and that curious creature is what we call an international organization. Now, the idea of an international organization first appears in the late 19th century. So, before we start off with the history of international organizations, an international organization by nature links issues, concerns across boundaries, and therefore the constitutive units of international organizations can either be individuals or member states. Now, that again is a contentious issue. This creature that we speak of, an international organization, IOs, in short, are creatures which can be brought about both by individuals, and that's exactly what takes place with the first IO created in Switzerland by a Swiss gentleman, Durand, who was at the end of the Battle of Solferino, was aghast at the treatment of combatants and non-combatants. And it is here that the first IO emerges, and that is the International Red Cross. Now, the genesis of the International Red Cross tells us a little bit about what IOs are. IOs stem from ethical, humanitarian, political, economic, a wide range of issues, but the foremost concern is to transcend boundaries with a common purpose. And it is here that we see that in the late 19th century, there are circumstances that facilitate this emergence of a global community, a global ethic, a global vision, and eventually one would talk about globalization. So what one is essentially looking at then when we look at the International Red Cross is an organization which is committed not to political ends, but has a concern for humanity in a humane way, and the zeal with which the International Red Cross became a humanitarian supported organization tells us that as individuals we do have a commitment beyond our national boundaries. So the International Red Cross was one of the earliest ones, and it is in the late 19th century that circumstances facilitate the speeding up of and the possibilities and the acceleration of the growth of these international organizations. The first would be, of course, communication. This is the age of the invention of the telegraph, the building up of the international postal system, communications in all its form, whether it was via sea, via air, was certainly speeding up, and that certainly brought together a cohesive idea, a vision of what international organizations could achieve. It is also at the end of the 19th century that we see organizations being set up for a variety of reasons. For instance, it is in 1894 that the International Olympics Committee is set up in Lausanne in Switzerland, and that of course is with a zeal to recreate the Olympics as a competitive game between gymnasts, between athletics, which was held in Greece thousands of years ago. It is an attempt to revive it. And again, it is here that we see that unlike the Greek competition, the International Olympic Association is organized around nation states. Similarly, one sees that there are other organizations like the International Women's Christian Association, the International Christian Men's Association, and these are associations which are governed around ethical issues, religious issues. You have an international association for chess, for stamp collecting, for nudism, for art. So clearly it is at this time that people are picking up the initiative to establish linkages across boundaries, across nations, and this is of course being facilitated by the technology of their times, the telegraph, the postal system being a few of them. By the early 20th century is when the International Labour Organization is similarly set up. But international organizations really begin to build up by the end of the First World War. And in a yearbook published at the end of the First World War, collects data about the number of international organizations. There are already at least 100 international organizations of a variety of kind. But the one international organization which really grabs our attention at this time is the League of Nations, established at the end of the First World War. Now we've looked at the League of Nations from a different perspective, from a liberal point of view, and we'll be looking at it as an international organization right now. The League of Nations was set up by the victor states at the end of the First World War, and as we know that this is a period of where the victor states were also colonizing states. So each of the victor states of the First World War also had their colonies. We're referring to, of course, France and Great Britain. And it is here that Woodrow Wilson wants to put in the rights of the colonized as a mandate of under the League of Nations, and there is a bit of conflict or confrontation between Great Britain and the USA about this contentious matter, whether the colonized have a right to self-determination, or extremely prickly political matter. And the League of Nations decides to put it under the system of mandates, which again is a colonial way of addressing colonized people and denying them their rights and their right to self-determination. The League of Nations is the earliest organization which is committed to peace and security. So as an organization, it is built, designed with the intention to prevent the occurrence of a Second World War. And it does that by putting into place a concept called collective security, open diplomacy. President Woodrow Wilson was championing open diplomacy as a way to prevent secret diplomatic alliances which had emerged, which had caused the First World War. So, in many ways, one can see that there is a non-state actor emerging from the intentions of states. It is being given a certain gravitas, a certain responsibility, a certain vision which possibly state actors do not have. And it is also being seen as something which can address global peace. And there is an admission here that perhaps particular nation states or states cannot achieve what an international organization can, and therefore by the early 20th century one sees that international organizations are tumbling out as creatures of hope, creatures of transnationalism, creatures who can embody visions and ideals which individual states cannot. We do know that the Second World War does take place and the League of Nations is unable to prevent it. It is also around this time that critics and writers of all kinds, from E.H. Carr to Leonard Woolf to David Mitrani, who we will be meeting again during this lecture, are consciously thinking about the possibilities which international organizations can throw up. And many of these possibilities are realized even while the Second World War is taking place. The Second World War starts in 1939. The world is divided between the Allied and the Axis powers. And during the war itself, there begin negotiations and discussions for the reconstruction of the world, the post-World War order. And all of these take place in America, and it is here that the seeds of gigantic universal international organizations are sowed. And these would be the negotiations which take place in Dumbarton Oaks, at Yalta, at Potsdam, at Bretton Woods. And it is here that international organizations are seen as that body which is above states and which can address issues of peace and security and a vast array of issues. In October 1945, the United Nations is set up as a successor to the League of Nations, and it is far more institutionalized compared to the League of Nations. The United Nations, as envisioned, has a General Assembly constituting of all the member states of the United Nations. It also has a Security Council which has the permanent 5 members, and it is these 5 members who are the big 3. They are called the big 3 during the Second World War, and this would be Roosevelt of America, Churchill of Great Britain, and Stalin of USSR. And this vision of the big 3 working together didn't quite work out, because their cooperation during the war evaporated when the war ended. But there was a hope that great powers would be able to cooperate in order to prevent war and ensure peace. And it is here that we look at the preamble of the United Nations Charter. So if you do have the opportunity to pick up the United Nations Charter, which is a very slim book, possibly the size of your palm and can fit in your pocket very easily. The United Nations Charter is that slender document which held the hope of these warring nations that we, the nations of this world, can eliminate the scourge of war. The Charter starts off by looking at maintaining peace and security, maintaining cordial relations with neighbors, upholding human rights and standards of human life and dignity. So it is almost ironic that it is from the ashes of the Second World War that this vision emerges of a international organization taking that up, and that's the United Nations. So as I mentioned, there is the General Assembly, there is the Security Council with the permanent 5 members. Those would be Great Britain, USA, China, Russia, and France, and the USA, sorry. And these 5 states have what is called the veto power, which is that during a decision, no decision can be implemented if one of them disagrees. So it requires the consensus of all 5. And there is also Secretary General, upon who represents the United Nations, and there is a wide variety of subsidiary bodies set up. One of them, for instance, is the United Nations Committee for Refugees. There is the UNESCO, which is for educational, scientific, cultural organization. And it is here that IOs truly accelerate in numbers, they mushroom in numbers, and there is a variety of them, from the gravest of matters, such as that of refugees, looking to refugees, and in 1946, for instance, there is the International Whaling Commission set up to look into the issue of these large marine animals. So the 1940s and the 1950s are a period when IOs are being looked at as recipes for peace, as implementers of peace, as solutions for the many problems that have been afflicted in which international politics is afflicted by. And you also see that there is an emergence of a non-state actor which has greater control and is vested with certain powers which states do not. Now, up to this point, international politics is dominated by Western powers, China being the only one which represents Asia, and the P5 states are also representative of the 5 continents, and therefore China represented Asia. But between 1945 and 1946 is when one sees a huge spate in the third wave of decolonization, when one sees newly liberated states staking their membership, staking their claim as sovereign participants in international politics. And it is here that international organizations then shifts from being a first world manifestation, first world creation, to being a third world participation from the third world as well. So by the 1960s, when the membership of the General Assembly has accelerated, has increased tremendously by the new members, by the newly decolonized states, one also sees the emergence of third world organizations, international organizations, and by the late 1960s, there is a call for a new international economic order. This is also a time when dependency theorists like Cardoso and Rolf Prebisch and Andre Gunder Frank and Emanuel Wallerstein are arguing about third world countries disassociating or disconnecting from their dependency. And it is here that one sees the emergence of a third world unity in the shape of NIEO, and we know that in the 1970s the Yom Kippur War takes place. There is the oil crisis, the value of the dollar slides considerably against the gold stock. So there are considerable changes and dynamics which allows the emergence of the G77, again an international organization which is reflective of the distinct needs of third world countries. So what one sees is that international organizations are reflective of international politics, the changes in international politics, and it is also at this time that one sees that civil society starts contributing in terms of international scientific panels. So by 1988, you have the International Panel on Climate Change, which has a number of scientists, people who are drawn in from civil society, who are now looking at issues not as a nation state at all, but from a scientific objective point of view. So we're going to pause over here and look at how far we've come in evaluating international organizations, and then we're going to look at the various ways in which one can categorize an international organization. So what we've seen so far is that the late 19th and 20th century is the period where international organizations really bloom. It is also stems from a admission of states of their incapacity to govern, and by the end of the 20th century, one sees that there are a wide variety of international organizations. You have the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, you have the Warsaw Pact in Europe, you also have the emergence of the Europe coal and steel community, which would then become the European Union. You have the CENTO, the G77, and along with that you have financial organizations such as the IMF and the World Bank. So we're going to pause over here and look at the categorization of Keohane and Nye, Robert Keohane and Joseph Nye's categorization of these international organizations. And they argue that these organizations foster interdependence, they foster a certain transnationalism, and that transnationalism could be of a variety of kinds, whether it is financial markets, the flow of trade and objects, but there is a certain coming together of the world through these international organizations, and this is accompanied by several texts, several writers who are mulling upon the possibilities of supranationalism or supra-regionalism, by which we mean something which is greater than states and moving beyond its boundaries. So having said that, let's just stop and look at the membership of international organizations, whether one can make a categorization on the basis of the membership of those states. So here we refer to the classic text on international organizations by Clive Archer. The book is incisive and covers possibly every aspect of international organizations, and Archer argues that international organizations can be divided on the basis of membership between state and non-state actors, by which he means that several organizations are constituted by sovereign states. But there are also organizations such as the World Meteorological Organization, which looks at civil society and non-state actors as members, which means that international organizations have a legal personality. We've looked at international law, and within international law, states are given a certain legal personality, and a few international organizations need not even have a member constituent states as their members. And of course, the reference here is here to MNCs, multinational corporations, which in many ways are international organizations in terms of their reach, their scope, their scale of operation, and how deep their tentacles travel across the world. So MNCs certainly are a kind of an international organization, but they aren't international organizations in the truest sense, but they also reflect as to how international actors are of a wide variety and of all kinds of configurations, and combinations, and MNCs are just one of them. So whether it is Nike, whether it is McDonald's, whether it is Pepsi, whether it is Gap, or oil companies, these Exxon is what comes to mind. These companies certainly have a global reach, and they certainly fall into what Kyohin and I define as the growing transnationalism, and something which accelerates that interdependence between and economic linkages along with that. So we've looked at international organizations of three kinds. One, which are constituted by member states, such as United Nations, the clearest example, SAARC, the the organization which links South Asian states together, would be classic examples. And then you also have issue-based organizations like OPEC, and then you have organizations like MNCs, which are not classic international organizations, but they do have a role to play. They have a considerable political influence on international politics. And those are the two ways in categorizing international organizations as the constituent members. Who are the members, whether they are states and or whether they are not states. So that's the first categorization on the basis of membership. The second form of categorizing international organizations is by looking at its scope, and over here Archer distinguishes between universal and regional. So again, organizations like the IMF, which enjoys a membership of almost every sovereign state, about 190 and above. The World Trade Organization, formed in 1995, again more than 190 states. The United Nations, the General Assembly, are all examples of a universal membership. The United Nations body on human rights, on women's rights, are bodies which have a universal scope. And on the other end you have regional organizations, classic example being NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the NAFTA, the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, the European Union, again which is completely regional in scope, hope, and its scope is completely regional. So one can see that there are a large variety of international organizations, and in the next section I'll be looking at how the manner in which international organizations play out, and how theorists theorize these international organizations. But before we get to that stage, just a small example of the power and authority that IOs wield on us. We often imagine the international as something away from us, at a distant future, at a distance for sure. In 1999, in Seattle, a ministerial meeting was to be organized of the World Trade Organization, and it is at this point in Seattle in this year that which witnesses a huge number of protesters, young university students, people championing the environment, people protesting against the imposition of the World Trade Organization. And if there is one organization which invites debate and dissent to a very passionate degree, it would be the World Trade Organization. Now, the protests in 1999 were against the increasing invasive authority allowed by the WTO, which meant that the World Trade Organization would have authority on matters which nation states previously had. So when we're looking at the evolution of international organizations, there is also a conflict, a tension a palpable tension between nation states and international organizations, and there is a accompanying debate about the corrosion of the sovereignty of these states over their own boundaries and the growing invasive authority of international organizations. So, the World Trade Organization as an organization has been the site of protest, rejection, of questioning its mandate, and the World Trade Organization highlights the conflict of sovereignty. Who has an authority over people? Is it the state or is it the World Trade Organization? And for those who are interested, the 1999 demonstrations against the WTO also were upheld as a fight against globalization. So we see that there are two interlaced ideas over here. The first is that international organizations have a mandate which is global in nature, and that authority is something which is handed over by states. And yet at the same time there is a refusal, there is a push against that authority handed over to international organizations, and the World Trade Organization, the protest against that is just one of the many examples of resisting that invasion and resisting that authority, which also corrodes the authority of the nation state. So before we look into the role and functions of international organizations, it might be useful to stop and look at the qualifications of being an international organization. And the reason why I say that is because in the 21st century there is a wide range of actors who have private interests, who nonetheless have a global reach. And of course the example that comes to one's mind is the almost insane influence of Facebook as a global network connecting people across boundaries, but also one which has a considerable influence in how and what people see, the opinions they read and the opinions that they make. So what one can say is that in international, in IR, there are a vast number of a range of non-state actors. International organizations are one of them, and MNCs, other bodies which have private interests are of another, and therefore it does help to pause and look at that criteria of an international organization. And the person who we turn to is the writer Anthony Judge. And Anthony Judge lists out a few criteria which allows us then to evaluate whether an organization is an IO or not. So the first thing he points out is that the scope and intention must be global and must have at least more than 3 states. And over here when we talk about a global reach, it of course allows MNCs to be considered, but not with the second criteria. These member states must have voting rights, which allows policies and decisions to be made on a democratic basis. Voting rights must be equally shared between member states. No one member state should be allowed a greater voting right or a greater occupation of a seat for more than a stipulated period of time. Most importantly, perhaps, Judge points out as to how international organizations must cooperate and comply with other bodies, be it states or non-state actors, which means that the basic idea is to cooperate, integrate, rely on one another and achieve common purpose. The last criteria the Judge lists out is that there must be a headquarters, a permanent headquarters, and we do know that most international organizations have One, the WTO has one in Switzerland, the United Nations is in New York, and international organizations must have a headquarters, a building, a bureaucratic structure where they employ, recruit individuals who are working for with the vast amounts of paperwork and sessions and objectives to be realized. Now, with this, we also see the emergence of an international set of workers, people who work for international organizations, also have certain benefits which others do not, and are part of an international bureaucracy as against a national bureaucracy. People appointed in the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization are just a few, but there's a vast array of international organizations which are committed to environmental, to the preservation of the environment, whether it is Greenpeace, Oxfam. These are non-governmental organizations, international INGOs, but cooperation with them allows them to see them work with a certain solidarity. So Judges' criteria tells us that international organizations work alongside other actors, be it states, be it international non-government organizations such as Greenpeace and Oxfam, Amnesty International, Doctors Beyond Boundaries, the Red Cross would be classic examples of organizations which do not have member states but nonetheless have a global reach and a global outlook and aim to integrate the world and treat it as one. Having done that, we are now going to look at the roles and functions of international organizations, and we return here to Clive Archer. And Clive Archer lists out three roles played by IOs, and the first one is that of an instrument. Now, Gunnar Myrdal tells us that international organizations are something above states themselves. They have a personality which comes from the combined responsibility vested in them, and they have a certain power over us, over states, and at the same time that can be wielded against states themselves. Now, classic example of that is that of an instrument. Can a IO be treated as an instrument to achieve a particular state's ends? And we see that the United Nations was the instrument in America's hands in the early decades from 1945 to 1960, when the General Assembly had still not been populated by newly decolonized states. And it is here that we see that the United States uses the United Nations, leading one to say that the United Nations is the United States. It does a number of things in pushing off the USSR, whether it is the creation of Israel, whether it is preventing USSR from interfering in North Iran, whether it is the North Korean issue, whether it is the appointment of the extension of the term of Tryggve Lie, who was the Secretary General. One sees that the United States uses the United Nations as a means to its own end. Of course, the USSR does veto certain efforts, but we also see that organizations can be manipulated, can be used to achieve a nation's interest, and this period of the United Nations is a classic example of the USA using it to its own personal private gains and interests during the Cold War. So the first way in which organization can be used is by using it as a tool, by a state using it as a tool and as a means to a particular end. The second is that of arena, and over here we see that the General Assembly is a spectacular ground. It's like a world parliament where states come together, make speeches, put forward political agendas, and also invite global attention on that particular space. So, the General Assembly is a democratic space for states, member states to look at, to draw attention to particular issues. And over here we see that UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, which was a key area, which was a fundamental political issue of developing states, was used very ably in by developing countries, whether it is the NIEO, and similarly in the Conference on Environment in Stockholm in 1972, Indira Gandhi made the famous speech connecting poverty to pollution. So, international organizations also function as a platform, as an arena, as a way in which individual states can make political declarations, spirited speeches, and there are multiple sites of looking at these arenas as platforms for states to enact their to make their speeches and to make political positions. The third, so we've looked at actor, arena, and the third way in which IOs are as instruments. And over here we see that certain organizations have powers against sovereign states themselves, which means that once these organizations have taken shape, they exercise a power above sovereign states, which means that sovereign states no longer have can no longer manipulate, control, influence these international organizations. And of course the one organization which comes to mind is the International Criminal Tribunal, and this is a tribunal which sits at The Hague in the Netherlands. And this organization is remarkable for divesting itself, for detaching itself from nation states. So even though states appoint lawyers, are appointed within this tribunal, decisions, debates, consequences of the International Criminal Tribunal are something which cannot be questioned, which are above the sovereign state themselves. So the International Criminal Tribunal itself has had interesting history. States like the United States have been unsure about whether such a supra-sovereign, such a supra-sovereignty should be allowed to a tribunal. And of course it has had the history of the International Criminal Tribunal has been rich in picking up cases, prosecuting criminals, highlighting issues of international justice. States can petition them. And the second organization which similarly has authority over states is the dispute settlement body, the DSB of the WTO. Now, like the International Criminal Tribunal, the dispute settlement body of the World Trade Organization similarly functions as a body which has authority over sovereign states. And again, that brings us to the classic conflict between international organizations and states. Who has a greater role over the other? Who is corroding the force of the other? And eventually, we are looking at a structure of global governance, where global governance is imagined to be the side-by-side cooperation of states, international organizations, international non-governmental organizations, aligning themselves together for cooperating with each other, relying on each other for integrated world, which is what a global community is about. So what we've seen so far is that international organizations have a variety of functions. These would be, which we just listed out, would be actor, arena and instrument. The last bit about the instrument is perhaps the most divisive and debatable, about the right of certain tribunals, certain bodies over sovereign states itself. And even within the World Trade Organization, there have been verdicts where powerful states such as the USA has lost a case, which tells us about the neutrality of these proceedings and also perhaps the ability of these organizations to be really supra national and above the nation and its boundaries. Right, so what we've done so far is we've looked at a wide variety of international organizations. We've seen its multiplicity. So as of now, there are general speculations and the data suggests that there are more than 2,000 organizations, and this is a time when the compression of time and space and telecommunications has aided the growth of international organizations. But having said that, several forms of them exist, and in the last section of today's lecture we're going to be looking at as to how theorists have looked at IOs and how have they engaged with IOs as a new category of actors on the international realm. So let's start off with realism. Realism, as we know, places a huge mandate on the role of the state, whether it is Walls, whether it is Morgenthau or E.H. Carr. The state is the primary constituent actor of international politics. So realists are skeptical about the sovereign authority of international organizations, and they're inclined to believe that international IOs are arenas and actors, but can seldom be greater than states themselves. And realists tell us that eventually power flows from the state. The state's authority over the monopoly of violence is one area which IOs can never compete, the right to use violence. And IOs exist as a subsidiary force, as an alliance, but the key figures are primarily states, and states are not going to grant that, are not going to cede that authority which they have based on their wealth, based on their material capabilities, based on their military capabilities, is something which does not take away from the sovereign right of the state. So whether it is the right to wage wars, the ability to use violence, realists are unshakable in their faith that IOs exist as a corollary, but not as the primary constituent of international politics. We now come to liberal institutionalists, and liberal institutionalists celebrate international organizations because international organizations, as Robert Keohane and Joseph Nye tell us, foster interdependence in multiple ways, in travel, in finance, in the global flow of people and objects. And let us remind ourselves that liberal institutionalists place a huge premium on the magical powers of trade. So for liberal institutionalists, IOs are that panacea, are that body, are that organization which aid in melting tariff barriers and in aiding the flow of trade. Within within liberal institutionalism, a major contribution has been made by the scholar David Mitrani, whose views are categorized as functionalism. Now, David Mitrani is a philosopher, a thinker who is writing, not a philosopher, thinker and writer primarily, is writing before the Second World War and also after the Second World War. And his vision is called functionalism because he imagines a global organizations on the basis of the functions that we need to provide. So whether it is the International Organization of Health, of sanitary issues, of the environment, Mitrani believes that organizing the world around issues rather than states is a way of moving forward and of organizing the world not along nation states but along issues. So functionalism looks at facilitating, looks at bettering world conditions on the basis of issues. So security issues, peace issues, humanitarian issues, refugee issues would be much better managed if we allowed ourselves to have a borderless understanding to this. And the clearest example of Mitrani's views and opinions are of course the European Union. The European Union started off as an organization of coal and steel, where it was imagined that the quick and easy shift from one part to another would only aid integration. So Mitrani's views are certainly influential, and one can see that it does have a tangible impact on global politics. Functionalism is a point of view which allows the emergence of organizations on the basis of issues is what he's arguing. So liberalism, realism and functionalism, and we come to the fourth one, and that is Marxism. Now interestingly, Marxism, we've looked at the theory of Marxism in the previous lecture, but Marxism as a perspective of international organizations in the 1960s and the 1970s, when we look at Julius Nyare and other theorists who were critical of global integration, one sees that there was a certain distancing from international organizations itself. So whether it is the non-alignment movement, whether it is other exponents of detachment, of distancing, whether it is Rolf Prebisch, whether it is Cardoso, one sees that there was an active resistance to international organizations, and this is reflected most clearly in the resistance to globalization itself. So when we look at the Marxist understanding of international organization, it is linked to a resistance to the global capitalizing transformations, and over here we have Marxist scholars such as Justin Rosenberg, David Harvey, amongst others, who critique the form of globalization which is being facilitated, which only broadens the gap between the rich and the poor. Now, a small example of that are movies such as Erin Brockovich, which highlight the plight of individuals against this vast corporation which is profiteering and plundering with reckless indifference to the cost of humanity. So Marxist and left-leaning positions on international organizations are slightly hesitant about the consequences of these organizations playing a role in our lives. And of course, the classic examples over here are the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Trade Organization and the World Bank. And there has been a classic resistance to these organizations on the basis of the neoliberal policies that they encourage, the neoliberal policies that they spout, and the manner in which they loop in states under what is called the structural adjustment program. So international organizations are far from neutral, and we do know that the Bretton Woods institutions are a highly contested financial institutions with a great degree of control over our lives. Structural adjustment programs are those programs which bring in developing countries into the mesh of neoliberalism, and as a consequence underdevelop these economies. So the left and the Marxist understanding of international organizations is fairly distinct from Mitrani's functionalism, from the neoliberal celebration of international organizations. And therefore we come to the end of today's lecture by looking at IOs as part of the globalizing world. IOs have aided the emergence of a global community, have aided the facilitation of a global community, have aided globalization. And therefore we end today's lecture with questions of what is globalization, what is the nature of globalization, and who is globalizing and at whose cost, rather. And these are the issues that we will be taking up in the subsequent two lectures, where we will be looking at the state and the nation and globalization. So just to sum it up, IOs are creatures of the 20th century. They are created by states but often have a power over states, and they're certainly creatures which are here to stay because they do things which states are incapable or are reluctant to do. A classic example being that of peacekeeping. So those of you who are interested could look up the politics of United Nations peacekeepers, especially during the Cold War, and the politics around that. And all of these are extremely rich, interesting areas, whether it's the International Crime Tribunal or peacekeeping or the Amnesty International. So with that, I stop here, and in the subsequent lecture, I will be looking at the modern state and issues of globalization. Thank you.